Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 161 and I am the show's host, Kyle. On today's episode of Foreign Policy Focus, I have a lot to say about the UN. Of course, the UN is the not quite world government, but certainly holds a lot of power on the world stage. And I think a lot of that power is used to either do or ignore or justify a whole lot of evil. So gonna get into some of those stories today, and if that's something you want to share, explain to your friends why they should all vote for politicians who want to defund the UN. So if you want to do that, think about sharing the show, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com or libertarianinstitute.org. And you guys can also get all the news that, I put out, that I read. I got a brand new website, immersionnews.com. Check it out. Alright, so the big news, what's going on with the UN right now is the Syrian ceasefire deal. Of course, there's a lot that we could kind of talk about and pull into this discussion. One of the things that kind of happens is in the UN is that the real UN body with power is the UN Security Council. And while it has 15 member states, 10 of them are non-permanent and rotate in and out. And then 5 permanent member states, US, UK, France, Russia, China. Most of the power is held in the hands of the 5 permanent state members who could veto any resolution that comes up. So if we're dealing with an issue with like North Korea or Syria or Iran, typically the 3 Western countries, the UK, US, and France, all have a particular position that they're pushing. And so they propose sanctions against Iran, sanctions against North Korea, different actions to take against Assad. And while that resolution may have enough votes on the UN Security Council to pass, because Russia and China have absolute veto power, they stop these resolutions from going through. And so this also often provides the context for the U.S. to propose something completely ridiculous, like a ceasefire in Syria or additional sanctions that pretty much blockade North Korea entirely. And these situations would cause absolute terrible humanitarian problems, or in some cases just really help terrorists a lot, that being Syria. Russia and China have to be the ones who step up and say, no, we're not going to do this because this is really stupid. But then, because Russia and China are standing up to a policy that's billed in the U.S. and the Western media as a policy to free the North Koreans from the dangerous Kim Jong-un, or a policy to stop Assad from killing poor little Syrian babies, this allows for a huge chunk of demonization of Russia and China in the Western media. And I think really plays on the politicians who really don't understand what's going on in the Middle East or around the world. And so when they hear, oh, we would have a ceasefire today in Syria and a bunch of innocent people would be fed and we would make sure that Assad stops killing babies, but Russia got in the way and prevented that. A lot of people, politicians included, go, oh, well, and assume that must be true. And so I guess I wanted to point out that part. I noticed a little bit of a tangent before I even really get into the discussion, but it's important to see how this is a really big negative. And of course, the United States bills, both in Trump's State of the Union address, the National Defense Strategy, the National Security Strategy, Russia and China as being the revisionist powers. And this is where the United States is now shifting their military attention and our national security attention overseas. And this is one of the ways that they're really able to build that demonization to the American people and politicians. All right, so getting it back into the Syrian ceasefire. What really prompted this ceasefire and where all the propaganda comes from is the situation in East Ghouta. This is a neighborhood or suburb area of Damascus, which is the capital of Syria. It's been held by rebels for quite a long time. If everybody can remember all the way back to 2013, we had a situation where there was an alleged Assad chemical weapons attack against the people and rebel groups in eastern Ghouta. Now, luckily, Obama didn't go through with his red line and decided to go to war with Assad then, and that was largely because Putin agreed to destroy all of Assad's chemical weapons. But it turned out that this was a false flag carried out by the Syrian rebel jihadist groups, likely with sarin they got through Turkey. So a long time this suburb of Damascus has been under siege. Attacks against the city of Damascus itself have been staged here. There's a lot of rebel groups with a lot of weaponry in that area, including terrorist rebel groups, including al-Nusra and some of al-Nusra's rebranded offshoots, Harar al-Sham, and I think there's some al-Zinki factions in that neighborhood as well. Now, this is a pretty big region of the city of Damascus. I think at one time the population was about 2 million. They now say in the Western media that the population in this area is about 400,000. Sources I've read, either Arab sources or just more contrarian alternative media sources, put that number at about 200,000. I would guess that the reality is somewhere in between those two numbers. Either way, there's a lot of civilians here, and there's 1,000 to 2,000 jihadist rebels in the area. Anyways, over the past week, Assad had ramped up a pretty heavy bombing campaign against East Ghouta. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, and I had a discussion about this on episode 159, but I'll try to do it very quickly, is a somewhat reliable but not super reliable source for death counts coming out of Syria. They have some sources on the ground. I think they use white helmets in some areas, and of course white helmets are in part a jihadist propaganda wing. I'm sure they do dig some people out from under the rubble of destroyed buildings as well, though, and do those kind of goodwill measures to the people, but definitely produce terrorist propaganda to try to fuel the West against the Assad regime. I see all the time them posting videos claiming Syrian chemical weapons attacks have occurred in rebel held areas of Syria. Oftentimes there's no credible evidence. So anyways, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights says that I think in a week about 500 or so people were killed by Syrian airstrikes in eastern Ghouta. I've seen other sources put the number at the mid 200s. Again, not sure what the truth is there. It's probably somewhere in between. But that being said, Assad is waging a pretty, ruthless bombing campaign against this area of jihadist-linked rebels. And in no way am I trying to justify what Assad is doing there. I think what's going on here is pretty comparable to what the United States did in both Raqqa and Mosul. And so I guess you guys can probably understand why it's a pretty complicated issue overall, because here you have a guy who's claiming to be the rightful rulers of Syria, and you have an army of Syrians fighting against terrorists, but in the process of doing so, they're going to kill thousands of civilians. So the US, UK, France kind of exploit these people deaths to try and push through a Syrian ceasefire. What they were trying to push is a 30-day ceasefire, and I think this would really allow rebels to strengthen and regroup, and we've seen this happen during ceasefires in the past, where the rebels are very strong after being able to kind of, like I said, regroup and then get new weaponry in. Now, Russia had really delayed this ceasefire from going through. I think with the understanding that the ceasefire, at least all the countries that are fighting in Syria, were never going to interpret the ceasefire to include terrorist groups. And since everybody in Syria, as you'll see as I go through the discussion, labels their enemies as terrorist groups, it really wasn't going to do anything. But it will allow for an awful lot of Western condemnation for the Assad regime for, kind of spitting in the face of the UN and their ceasefire. After delaying the ceasefire for a couple days, it gets passed, and then everybody pretty much ignores it. The Assad regime and the Iranians both said that their interpretation of the resolution was that it didn't apply to East Ghouta because the rebels there are terrorists. Also saw some interesting statements, and, I guess whenever I read these, I always had to kind of take them for what they're worth, because I have no idea, who these people fighting for, allegedly under Assad are. But, they were interviewing these troops that, are supposed to be either Assad or allied forces. And they're saying, we don't care about the UN. There's terrorists in our neighborhood and we're going to go kill them. And so I just want to show their relevance kind of all the way from the top down on this one. It's not like the people and the troops are saying, oh, well, maybe we should respect the UN ceasefire. They're more than willing to say, yeah, we don't believe in it. So the bombing there continues. The Russians have opposed a 5-hour-a-day ceasefire, and the purpose of this ceasefire is to allow people to leave East Ghouta if they're willing and able, and to allow some humanitarian resources to get in. As I talked about both the sieges of Mosul and Raqqa, one of the problems was that the civilians within the city started to starve close to the end of it because, the United States wasn't allowing people to cross back and forth because that would create situations where terrorists were able to get resources and supplies. And similarly, the terrorists don't want the people to leave because then nobody cares. If the Syrian government destroyed an entire neighborhood in Damascus, but only killed, Al-Qaeda rebels, nobody cares. especially nobody outside Syria. I mean, the people who get their houses blown up maybe, but most people outside living in that neighborhood really wouldn't care about something like that. However, in the first day that ceasefire was imposed, what happened was the rebel groups, the terrorist groups within East Ghouta started shelling the humanitarian corridors that the Syrian government had set up in kind of ISIS style, I guess, preventing civilians from fleeing by being willing to kill them. They also staged attacks against the Syrian government during that time too. And I guess this kind of shows why that the ceasefire wouldn't have worked either way. Is, even if we follow the UN ceasefire, the terrorists in that group don't have any respect for the UN, just like the troops fighting on the other side. And so they weren't going to listen to it either. So I think that gets you pretty much caught up on the story in East Ghouta. I know the US mainstream media is talking about a lot. They're using a lot of fear mongering to try to get the US more involved in Syria. We're at a kind of a critical situation in Syria, especially for the US government, where ISIS is quickly being completely eradicated in Syria. I guess there's always going to be people willing to pick up the banner and call themselves ISIS fighters. But even the small amounts of rural desert territory that they held over the past couple months are quickly being taken by opposing forces. In fact, the United States killed 25 people after the ceasefire was passed, go figure, trying to kill ISIS targets in southern Syria there. And so again, this is, kind of another front, which is southeast Syria, where the United States is fighting along the Euphrates River, at times bombing positions that are Assad allied forces, and at times bombing the Islamic State. Another big battlefront in Syria is Afrin, where the Kurds are the Turks are invading Syrian Kurdish held territory because they view the YPG, which is the Syrian Kurdish militia, as a terrorist organization. And so again, doesn't stop it whatsoever. Not that the UN Security Council resolution was in any way passed because anybody on the UN Security Council was concerned at all about Turkey's war in Afrin. Of course, Turkey is waging a pretty brutal war in Afrin. This was an area once really untouched by the Syrian civil war. The Syrian Kurds were able to take it and hold it through most of this war. And since the Assad government has been much more concerned with killing the Syrian rebels, terrorists, and ISIS groups than fighting against the Kurds, they've kind of been able to just live up there. But now Turkey has already displaced over 125,000 people. Well over 100 civilians have been killed, and this is, I think in the first month still of Operation Olive Branch, which is the very Orwellian named military operation for the Turks in eastern Syria. Turkey continues to use the Syrian rebels, especially this Euphrates Shield rebels. And this is the pocket of Syrian rebels that exist on the southern border of Turkey, kind of in the middle of Syria, stretching from the city of Manbij all the way to the Afrin area. It looks like the Turkish special forces are now going to enter in Syria. And this again is, I guess, another interesting thing that I want to bring up about the UN, is that one of the things that the UN was supposed to do is to prevent other countries from invading their neighbors and using that to kind of change their borders. And here we're going to have Turkey invade and then apparently occupy Kurdish-held Syria. And the United States has already occupied and held all the area east of the Euphrates River in Syria. And so, these are kind of clear violations of what the UN was set up to prevent. A couple of other stories I just want to touch on dealing with Turkey, ISIS, Syria. In Prague, Czech Republic, we have a former YPG leader arrested by officials there and I guess possibly being extradited to Turkey. This, of course, just kind of continues along Erdogan's political war against the Kurdish people. And then on the Iraq side of the border, we have an Iraqi court sentencing 15 Turkish women to death for their support for ISIS. It sounded to me like, at least from reading the source on it, is saying that these women all said, yep, we supported ISIS, this is what we believe in. And so hopefully this wasn't too kangaroo courty where we end up hanging 15 innocent women. However, I just always, find it interesting that let's say that these weren't Turkish women, but Iranian women. And you could imagine then you would get this rhetoric that even their women support their, terrorist factions and all this evil stuff that they would end up saying in order to justify war against somebody who isn't an ally. Last story I want to talk about dealing with the UN in Syria is that we have a BBC story, and I'll link to the video on the show notes page. And in this video, we have a woman who went to Syria to help distribute aid that was going through the UN. And it turns out that all the, alleged aid workers there, I guess all the people the UN hired to distribute aid are really just a bunch of scumbags who go out there and tell the women that if, you want toiletries and food, you gotta have sex with me. This is such a systemic problem in Syria that the women and nobody would go to get aid. Even if they weren't going to have sex to get the aid, they wouldn't do it anyways because it was so systemic. There was a stigma. Anybody who went and got aid from somebody associated with the UN was apparently, thought, well, that girl whored herself out for some food. And so, we talk about the ideas of fighting these counterinsurgencies and the idea that we could go into eastern Syria and we could establish rule of law and we could provide food and aid to the people as they rebuild their country. And then they won't want to live under Assad anymore. They'll be peaceful, free people who all want good things. But it only takes a couple instances of killing 13 civilians or so like the United States did in an airstrike just this past week. Or hiring aid workers that demand sets from the people they're supposed to be helping to make it completely irrelevant, right? Once you get the idea of that, the U.S. help is them, forcing you to whore yourself out. Nobody is going to see you as the people justifying the rule of law. And of course, I'm sure none of these UN aid workers will face justice either in a UN court or in a Syrian court where I guess they, really should be held and tried. In Somalia, we have 38 people killed in a car bombing. In spite of the fact that we have all these international troops now in Syria and Somalia, I'm not sure if there's that many UN peacekeepers still there, but the African Union is deployed there, the United States is deployed there, the Ethiopians and the Kenyans are deployed there. It doesn't make a difference and the slaughter continues. In Afghanistan, we have the Taliban again calling for peace talks. Now, assuming that the UN is supposed to be the international force for good, it should facilitate these talks between the US and the Taliban. But the UN will do no such thing. At best, they'll stay silent on the issue. At worst, they'll say, well, the US really shouldn't be negotiating with the Taliban and continue to justify the US-led war there. Another interesting story kind of coming out of the Afghanistan war is that there's an international agency that's able to sanction different countries if they don't live up to kind of having strict enough standards to prevent people in their country from financing terrorists. Now, you won't be surprised to find out, I suppose, that Israel isn't one of these countries, even though they provide actual support to terrorist groups in Syria. But Pakistan was being threatened to put on the list. And I think it's largely for their allowing support for the Haqqani network and the Taliban in Afghanistan there. Now, apparently it was the United States and Western countries pushing to put Pakistan on this list. And it was maybe Saudi Arabia and China leading the charge to keep them off. Pakistan doesn't end up on that list. However, it's interesting to note that I've seen a couple stories, and I'll link to one of them in the show notes page, that the United States is now telling Pakistan that they don't have to kill these guys that are the Haqqani network or the Taliban, but just to force them all back into Afghanistan. And I guess we'll kind of see what happens as we move along. And I guess if Pakistan could actually enforce it, it may be that Pakistan just doesn't control a lot of these areas. There's a huge Pashtun population in Pakistan, as well as several other ethnic groups. And the central government really doesn't have a whole lot of control over the entire country. And so it's possible that they just don't have the ability to force these people out of their country. It's also possible that they don't have the motivation to, and that doing so would even improve the U.S. situation in Afghanistan whatsoever. If you remember back to my episodes discussing ISIS Khorasan, which is the Islamic State affiliate group in Afghanistan, these are people who are refugees from the U.S. drone war in Pakistan waged against the Trinki Taliban, who fled into Afghanistan and then set up ISIS-K. The last situation I want to talk about in today's show is Yemen. What happened over the weekend is that the U.S. and I think the UK kind of headlined the charge. Were fighting to put, I guess, a resolution against Iran. And I'll explain why I think this resolution is really important in a second. But what the resolution would do would be condemn or acknowledge that Iran was supplying the Houthis with weapons. The Houthis are, of course, the group that control the northern and eastern portion of the Yemen state and who is on the receiving end of the United States and Saudi war against Yemen. There's no clear evidence that the Iranians armed the Houthis, but putting Iran and passing this resolution possibly would have been a way for the Western countries to argue that Iran was in violation of the P5+1 nuclear agreement, and I think would certainly have been an excuse for United States politicians and leaders to say that the Joint Plan of Action for Iran, the law that was passed to support the Iranian nuclear agreement, is out of date now. And so this is really, really sad because the situation, what's going on in Yemen right now is Saudi Arabia is blockading that country. At times, this is a full blockade, including humanitarian aid. At all times, that blockade is a commercial blockade as well, preventing commercial food and fuel from reaching Yemen, specifically the people in northern Yemen. Saudi Arabia has bombed indiscriminately, killing people at hospitals, schools, and ambulances, destroying roads and bridges, destroying factories and water treatment plants, and essentially just devastating the infrastructure and the people in northern Yemen to the point where 17.8 million people in Yemen are now in need of pretty urgent humanitarian assistance. And yet it's not the United States coming out to condemn Saudi Arabia and looking to pass resolutions against Saudi Arabia. In fact, this isn't really happening in the UN at all, that anybody is looking to attack Saudi Arabia for what they're doing and their humanitarian crimes in Yemen. However, they're trying to call out and blame Iran for the whole thing. And so I think this is where we see the worst part of what the UN is. Because the UN exists as an organization to prevent these things from happening, to prevent 20 million people in Yemen from needing humanitarian assistance, possibly hundreds of thousands, if not millions of them actually dying. But the UN doesn't do anything, and in fact, they blame somebody else. So now everybody doesn't know or think Saudi Arabia is doing anything wrong because the group that would be out there to punish them isn't doing it. It's kind of like in the United States where, if somebody is really guilty, then they'll get convicted, even if they aren't really guilty or if somebody else is guilty of the crime or whatever. There's an assumption that if you have a system of justice, that the justice is being upheld and you could kind of accept the outcomes from that. And so nobody ever, does any real investigations of what's going on in Yemen because the United Nations should be doing that. They're the overall authority on it too. So when they go ahead and attack Iran and blame Iran for, being the group that's making the humanitarian situation in Yemen awful and prolonging the war there, then everybody says, oh, well, it's Iran or nothing. The war in Yemen continues. I saw today another 15 people were killed by a Saudi bomb hitting their house. I saw a couple weeks ago, this is something I just wanted to bring up because I had talked about it on the show in the past, that the Saudis dropped a lot of cluster bombs on Yemen, and I'm not sure if they still are, but the cluster bombs drop a whole bunch of little tiny balls that also explode. Now the problem is not all these tiny little balls explode right away, and so eventually some kid either picks it up or steps on it and blows off an arm or a leg. And that, this is going on right now in Yemen. So I think that's about all I have for today, but I just want to again stress that overall message of what the UN is doing is absolutely terrible. In Syria, it's either irrelevant or they're, kind of being deployed, or employing and deploying a rape force that goes out there and trades, food and humanitarian aid for sex. And of course, again, kind of like the issue I just brought up with Yemen, everybody assumes that the UN is going in there and feeding these people and giving them shelter, food, toiletries, all the things they need to survive. However, that's not what they're doing. They're offering it in exchange for sex. And so now if all these people, like let's say in I think it's right now southeastern Syria, are choosing to go without and then developing infections or starving to death or something like that, nobody really knows or understands it because isn't the UN providing aid there? Well, yeah, like I said, they are, but in exchange for sex. You see places like Somalia where there's been tons of international intervention and the situation always gets worse. Complete inaction on Afghanistan as well. And then as you see from the Yemen situation, they blame the wrong guys. All right, that's where I wrap up the show for today. If you like it, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com. Share it, rating and review on iTunes, Stitcher. Check out the show on libertarianinstitute.org. Check out my brand new website, still under construction, but it's up and functional, especially on the PCs and I would assume the Macs too, but on laptops and desktops, not necessarily mobile versions. You check it out, immersionnews.com, IMMERSIONNEWS.com. Really cool new website. Provide you all the news, what you need to know, and I think you guys would really enjoy it. So definitely check that out. I'm also on Patreon now if you want to help out the show and help it to grow. It's Patreon/Foreign Policy Focus, on Twitter at KYAAALE. Thanks, everyone.